So today is Friday. It's December 2nd, and the theme of this week has been compassion. And so we're going to talk about St. Francis, the Fraticelli, and the Dulcinians. Bunch of history nerd shit, but I find it fascinating. So the basic gist for anyone who wants to know is, and Kaylee, you look like you're frozen and your microphone is muted. So I don't know what's going on there, but we'll figure it out. Um, so the so here's the story, children who are all watching for the history lesson for today. So you had Francis, who's kind of considered this exemplar of all the nice things. There's a reason that Francis is the most popular saint and a garden saint. Lots of little statues. It's because he loved the animals. He cared for the sick and the poor. He lived very simply. He had some rough edges. He could be judgmental and stuff. But generally speaking, so much of what he was about was wonderful and beautiful. And part of his commitment was to live the life that he saw patterned in the gospel of the way Jesus lived, without possessions, essentially homeless. Yeah, being like kind of, there's a way in which the spirituality of poverty can be kind of an interesting, challenging thing, because it seems like it's as much about as a spiritual piety thing as it is a way of redistributing resources to the poor. But Francis kind of lived into both. When he passed, there was a lot of struggle in the movement because it was sanctioned by the Pope and it was legitimate, and there's a lot of people who wanted it to become more legitimate. And so you had this impulse to start having what all the other religious orders had: convents and monasteries, things like that, and then possessions. But their vow of poverty meant they couldn't own anything. And so there was a workaround by the Pope. The Pope said, look, you can't own anything. What we'll do is the Holy See, the Vatican, will own stuff that you can just use. So you had these Franciscans, with some of which lived pretty opulently, but none of it was theirs. It was owned by the church. You can see how lots of people who are committed to the Franciscan thing would, say, hey, this is bullshit. And so what ended up happening is you had these groups break off. There was a split within the early Franciscans between the spirituals, those are the ones who wanted to live faithfully to the pure vision, and the conventuals, because they're the ones who had convents and owned stuff. And there's a lot of different groups within this, but all of them, the Fraticelli, were part of the Franciscan order, and it was a schism between them. And you had some pretty harsh actions where there was an attempt to persecute and label the Fraticelli as heretics, which kind of succeeded. But then the Fraticelli sometimes, or the spirituals, or the Fraticelli, which means the little brothers, these movements would sometimes seize, like by force, the different convents and try to bring them under kind of the purity of what they thought of as Francis's vision. This is around this time a lot of people started thinking of Francis as the second Christ, sometimes in a way that was just more of a honorary, like, hey, look, since Christ, there has been no one who's shown us the way of Christ so clear as this. He is perhaps like a second Christ. But then there were others who were like, no, he's a second Christ in some sort of deeper way. Here's where this is where the Dulcinians come in, who are among my favorite. So you had this group called the Apostolic Brethren that was started by Gerard Segarelli. So you had this dude who was poor, peasant, low birth, uneducated, right? Who tried to join the Franciscans, and he was rejected. Now, this is kind of interesting and ironic because there are people like this with Francis's early movement. Brother Juniper, who's one of my favorite of the Holy Fools, which I'll talk about in a little bit, was kind of like that. And so he was rejected, and because of that, he started his own movement called the Apostolic Brethren. They're not technically considered part of the Fraticelli because they weren't technically Franciscan. They weren't under that order. They were their own thing. And he started talking about this restoration of this purer vision of how the apostles lived and how Francis lived. He started preaching it and preaching against corruption, started to have some really radical ideas, but he was burnt at the stake on July 18th, 1300, as a heretic. And when that happened, you had this other group, the people that remained who scattered under this leadership of Gerard's. After Gerard passed, you had a new leader, Friar Dulcino of Navarra, who reformed the group of the Apostolic Brethren, and they were called after that. They were named after Dulcino. They were called the Dulcinians. And I'm going to bring Kaylee back in here because I want to talk about these things that they actually believed in. So here's the thing: so you had these Dulcinians, and they were inspired by St. Francis. They thought they wanted to continue in the legacy of St. Francis, and this is the stuff they taught. And they had a huge movement, and they were ultimately crushed. They believed that the ecclesiastical hierarchy should collapse and return to the original ideas of humility and poverty. Because of that, they rejected the power of the Pope and the authority of the Church. They believed that there shouldn't be a feudal system, that the feudal system should collapse, that humans should be liberated from any restraint of any systemic power. They believed in a new egalitarian society based on mutual aid and respect, holding property in common, and respecting gender equality.
This is why they were killed.
And they also believed in kind of this division of his church. This was kind of like a big thing that was Joaquim de Fiore taught this, and they were inspired by this, that they saw, and this is what makes it an apocalyptic movement. Radical movements almost always have an apocalyptic thing because they have this hope that God will intervene because, and people make fun of this shit because we think of Left Behind, but like when you're a peasant, look, a movement made of peasants, you see this throughout the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance kind of era. When you're lowly, you don't really believe you have the power to challenge the system. So you believe that God will have to intervene on your behalf. And so this is where these apocalyptic things, which we often talk about in isolation, but are almost always paired with some sort of social revolution thing. And why it's shitty that these things are usually dismissed as just crazy heresy. But they believe that there was 4 epochs: the period of the Old Testament, the period of Christ and the Apostles, and then they had the period of decline from like Emperor Constantine on, and then there'd be this new era of the apostolics, so the restoration of the church. So there's almost always a version of that. It's still common. People think that way.
Yeah, the new apostolic reformation is like a big thing right now, and it's if evangelicalism isn't a cult, then that line of thinking definitely is. But that's neither here nor there. But yeah, it's really interesting to me that like their ideas are not they're not radical ideas. Actually, they're ideas that have been found throughout history, but they're also like they're pretty common today. Not always in one unit, but still definitely like here and there. Like those ideas are actually rather common. Maybe some of the more radical, like Bible interpretations aren't quite as as common anymore, but the actual sorry, I'm having trouble with words. The actual
Okay.
point of their existence in the world, those aren't things that are actually that uncommon today.
Hmm. Well, and the thing is, like, um, most people don't know about these movements,
Yeah.
and they think so when they hear about them, they think they're fringe, but they weren't. They were just
No.
they just weren't powerful. They didn't have
Yeah.
people in high power, but these movements always caught on. And so even with these groups, kind of people derogatorily referred to them as Cathari, like to refer to the Cathars. They're like
Mhm.
people then lump them all in together. And the thing that a lot of these movements had in common is they were almost always apocalyptic, by their, in those contexts, leftist movements. Like
Yeah.
they wouldn't have used the word left and right then, but they wanted,
Mhm.
they were thought of as some sort of return to some sort of purer idea. And that purity impulse can be very gross, but in this context, it was leveled against systems of power and oppression, and they had a lot of popularity among the lower classes. Uh, and so what ended up happening, this is again why people will dismiss them, is because they will see them as violent. Because what happened was the Dulcinians and other groups would engage in banditry against the wealthy. So they were Robin Hooding it, right? And
Yeah.
they'd seize property from the church, from nobility who were allied with the church, and try to redistribute that wealth in different kinds of ways. Um, And so, like, people are like, oh, they're heretics and they're violent. I'm like, well, you know what? The established church was pretty damn violent, but
It really was.
we don't
Like,
really think about, people will almost always, because so much of how systemic power works is to legitimize its power and its violence. And people get duped. Even today, we will
yeah.
think of terrorist groups as particularly violent and then dismiss, like, whenever nations do violence,
Yeah.
as though
And
there's some sort of qualitative difference in terms of, like, like, because of how much power we give to the account to legitimacy, like,
yeah.
and then we don't stop and think, where does that legitimacy come from?
Yeah. That's why uh there was a um somebody wrote a paper and was published that talks about how the nation of Israel is one of the largest terrorist organizations.
Hmm.
But it I mean, I might make the argument that in a lot of ways the United States fits that too. But like Israel specifically and their struggle with Palestine, they use terror tactics to keep people in their place. And um, but because we as a nation see them as a legitimate national force, then we cast it off. And then there'll be people that call you anti-Semitic if you say that it's wrong that they're carrying out terrorist attacks on people that are supposed to be their actual people.
um Here's a little thing about the Dulcinians, and then I want to talk about how does this all tie into compassion. But I'm reading from the Wikipedia page because I'm lazy. Uh, so Dulcino, at the beginning of 1303, reunited the apostolic movement near Lake Garda. He met Margaret of Trent, his lover or sister in spirit. What's going on there? And wrote the second letter to the apostolics. At the beginning of 1304, 3 Dulcinians were burned by the Inquisition, leading Dulcino to evacuate the community to the west side of Sesia Valley, near his native Novara. At the end of 1304, only 1,400 survived on the top of Mount Parit Kalba and the fortified Piano de Gazzari. They descended the mountain to pillage and kill the people in the valley, responsible in their eyes for not defending the group against the episcopal troops. The villagers called them Gazzari, or Cathars, and joined the soldiers in opposition. Dulcino justified the acts committed by the Dulcinians by affirming their perfection and holiness based on St. Paul's epistle to Titus. chapter 1, verse 15. To the pure, all things are pure, but to the corrupt and unbelieving, nothing is pure. Their very minds and consciences are corrupted. So then Margaret and Dulcino were captured and executed. So, this is where this is the problem, is a lot of time these groups that are like trying to fight for some sort of bold revolution end up going off the rails because of desperation. And so, and we always think about these sorts of things of like, oh, well, they just wiped out some innocent villages because they were taking the side of the church. And it was a shit move, Dulcino. Yeah. And, it's that kind of thing happens a lot in a lot of, radical groups because they get
it's
locked
not
in.
even radical groups. If you read the history of Protestantism and look at Luther and Calvin, it's not just the radical people.
No, but the thing is, we'll elevate Luther and Calvin because they're legitimate.
Yeah.
Never mind the people that Calvin executed, or that Luther sided against the peasants in the peasant revolt and basically legitimized the wiping out of peasants who were fighting
sided
for.
With the you said it backwards. He sided with the nobles.
Yeah, the German princes, against the peasants. But we don't feel a problem. People are like, Luther, man of his time. The man of his time thing bugs me because you know what? Dulcino was a man of his time. Just like during kind of before the Civil War, who else, there were people who were slave owners that were people of their time, but then slaves were also people of their time. That's just such a weird argument.
It's one of those things like Jonathan Edwards, is upheld as this great American theologian and stuff. No, the dude was a slave owner, and held on to that ideology his entire life. I'm sorry, to me that's not a good theologian. That's not somebody to uphold. And you can say that he was a person of his time, but that doesn't change the fact that he thought owning other people was okay. And yeah.
So I want to tie in this idea of compassion, because we were talking about on Monday compassion. Well, Monday and Wednesday, compassion and solidarity. So you have, I appreciate the fact that Dulcino and the Dulcinians make a similar move that the point we were kind of making earlier in the week is that if you take this posture of Francis being compassionate, caring for the people, the least of these in front of him, logically, if Francis is embodying the way of Jesus in a way that we think is commendable, then by implication, the entirety of the church should be doing something similar in a systemic way.
Yeah.
That it should scale up. Now we tend to think, well, that fancy kind of complex systems analysis thing is a modern blah, blah, blah. But here you have a movement that was started by an illiterate peasant.
Yeah.
Saying, you know what? The church should be like that. And if it isn't, insofar it is not, it's because it's corruption and being in bed with power. And we need to start standing against that. And you have the Dulcinian movement spring out of that. And they weren't the only ones. There's a lot of movements like this kind of in that era of the Middle Ages that were kind of advocating for this because they understood that compassion writ large looks like the fall of ecclesiastical authority, the fall of the feudal system, human liberation from entrenched power, and a creation of a new egalitarian society based on mutual aid and respect, holding property in common and respecting gender equality. Those ideas, maybe not all of them, but we're in all these sorts of movements. You have the Beguines and the Begards, you have the Cathars, you have the Dulcinians, the different spiritualist movements, and then And you also see this thing that this happened during the Peasants' Revolt later on with the Radical Reformation. A number of these folks were accused of being too buddy-buddy with Muslims. This is always this weird recurring theme that if you're standing against the properly constituted authority, then it means you're pretty much with our enemy. And those are the Muslims, because they're always Middle Ages. You cannot understand the Middle Ages and the Reformation apart from the church's relationship with Islam. People always undercut that. But there's evidence that some of these folks did kind of like start becoming buddy with Muslims because because we don't like this in modern the way a lot of modern people think. We don't like thinking about this way, but a lot of like Muslims were living into these ideals in some ways that Christians were not. And so some people jumped over. So you have all this sort of glorious mix of people really trying to resist the authoritarian systems for something more egalitarian, because it was being driven by not only purity of doctrine, but also legitimate desire for liberation. And for them, it was about compassion. And we have that same battle and struggle in different kind of ways and contexts today. So anybody who's listening, feel free to leave your comments or questions. Maybe we could pivot to a couple commercials here. One, and let's see if I can share this particular screen. Here we go. Boom. So this kind of ties in a little bit, tangent, dovetails a little bit. In January, and you can go to our Facebook page for the Center for Prophetic Imagination, and there'll be a link there to this. I'll try to put something in the comments too. January term, I'm teaching a class on the tradition of the Holy Fool. So this is like a class that is kind of fulfilling an elective requirement for the spiritual direction program, but it's open to folks outside of that. So you don't have to be all spiritual directee to appreciate this. This is the Holy Fool is a figure who defies social conditions in bizarre ways, provoking deep reflection and challenging social sensibilities, usually through ways that might be seen as insane. And one of the examples of this, St. Francis is kind of considered part of this archetype, but particularly his early follower, Brother Juniper, who there's a whole story to that, but Brother Juniper would, wherever Brother Juniper went, the other Franciscans would make sure he didn't pocket expensive like candlesticks and shit from these churches, because he would just steal everything and give it to the poor, because he really believed the pure gospel thing, and so much so that he just acted out in ways that people thought were bizarre. But that's going to be in January, the Thursday nights in January from 6 to 8 p.m. Central Time. We'll be going through the tradition of the Holy Fool, which is much broader than, Brother Juniper, and then looking at what it can teach us today for a sort of subversive spirituality in our time. So that is, registration for that is sliding scale, but kind of pay what you can. Sliding scale has a set of guidelines, but pay what you can. And spots are limited, but there's still plenty of slots open. So people should check that out. And then maybe next week we'll talk about the spiritual direction program as a whole, which is taking applications for our next fall cohort in 2023. Also, part of the reason we're doing this broadcast is to kind of keep it in front of people that we are raising funds for our 2023 budget. So support the work of CPI. Go to propheticimagination.org. You can find links there, not only about what we want to do this coming year, but kind of our 3-phase plan going into the future. Small nonprofit. It's just the two of us working part-time, and we want to be more about the work of building networks and connections for broader social subversion, spiritual stuffs, prophetic shit, all that. So go to that link and you can find out more about what we're up to. And commercial. Do you have any favorite, like, at least within their context, radical spiritual movements throughout the church history? I don't know how much of a church history nerd you are. I know
I'm not actually.
You're a Bible nerd.
I'm
That's
a
history.
Bible nerd. Yeah, but my understanding of church history ends at like 100 AD.
Oh.
I mean, not completely. I personally, I'm a lot more interested in learning more about the Syriac Church and what Christianity did whenever it grew up outside the empire and moved into places like India and China, because it looks completely different than the Greek and the Roman churches.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of where I am, and I think a lot of it would be considered more radical. Even like aesthetic movements within the Roman Church, like still mostly those ideas originated from the Syriac Church. So
yeah, it's interesting the way in which the church, really quickly got ensnared within power and wealth in a way that shaped how it understood its vocation in the world, and we still have that. So I would imagine that a lot of people who are uncomfortable with, I mean, so far in this overall broadcast, we've kind of lifted up a slave woman who was forced into prostitution, who later called herself the redeemer of the world, and thought, hey, she's badass. And now I'm talking about the Dulcinians, and a lot of people are like, yeah, I like their ideas, but they went about it wrong, like that kind of thing. There's always that sort of thing, because people tend to think reform and progress are real things, and that these movements are distractions who make things worse for everybody.
Yeah, which is a false narrative. And like, if you look at the history of the stream of Christianity that I guess like won out over these reforms, like they didn't do much better. They just kind of hit it a little bit more. So
yeah.
It's
I mean, even like if you're a reformist, which I'm not really. I mean, it's not like I hate reform. It's just, to me, it's like making that the goal always seems like easily co-optable. But these movements, any reforms you see, there's always movements like this that are kind of it's like the carrot and the stick, good cop, bad cop. So like you have the fear of these sorts of movements taking root and spreading, often drive people in power to accommodate with the more reformist element. So you see this with FDR, with the rise of communism and anarchism within society leading up to World War, like in the years before World War II, and the very real possibility of a socialist uprising. And so then you had the powerful, like, taking the suggestions of FDR for like more of a progressive social platform. That wouldn't have happened without this fear of something more further left taking root. And so even at the reformist level, these sorts of movements are important, because it's like, well, I don't want that to happen, so I guess I'll settle for Social Security, like that kind of thing. I think that is still undervaluing these sorts of movements. The question then becomes like, where do we see this sort of impulse today? And where do we see spiritual and religious movements that have a very provocative social vision, that are building up, have enough cachet to be scary enough for the broader church and broader society and its relationships with power to shift? And I'm not, there's some of it, but I'm not seeing a lot of it. And part of it is because we live in a post-secular type kind of society where religion doesn't have the same place, but that's not the only reason. It's,
There's yeah, that'd be an entire like episode in and of itself on yeah.
But we're at the end of our time, everyone. So this is next week. Actually, I've said this before, but I've been wrong. In the past, I said, I'm not sure what we're talking about next week, but then I already had it figured out. I actually don't know what we're talking about next week, but we'll figure it out. We just have a few weeks left. We're going to talk about one of the weeks, we'll talk about discernment as the theme. One week, we'll talk about liminality or liminal space as a theme. And then we will end with the theme of resistance, which is kind of an overarching theme for all of this in a way. So those are the three themes coming up in the final few weeks, which means we have a few more weeks of fundraising ahead of us. And we are so far about, I think you calculated what, 5/8?
Yeah, we're 5/8 of the way there.
Towards our minimum goal, which is pretty good. So for those of you who are listening, know that like we're getting closer, and you can help us get even closer still. Spread the word, share this with your friends, your Aunt Patty, whoever, help us spread word, because we have some stuff we want to do that we think is good, because we're trying to live into the best of the spirit of these sorts of groups like the Dulcinians and the Rosa Egyptiaca and other liberationist movements. Yeah. So we will see y'all next week. Bye, everybody. Bye, Ruff in the background.
Yeah, my pets are my pets have been doing stuff the entire time.
Yeah, because they don't care about our authority.
I don't care about it.
They're little Dulcinians.
Yep.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.